The quiet war of obedience, when the spirit commands and the flesh rebels. There is a war taking place within every human being who seeks to live a life aligned with God. It is not a war of swords or armies, nor does it draw attention from the outside world. It unfolds quietly, internally, often unnoticed by others, and even misunderstood by the one experiencing it. This is the quiet war of obedience. It is the moment when the Spirit gives direction, clarity, conviction, and truth, and the flesh responds not with agreement, but with resistance. This inner conflict is not a sign of failure. Rather, it is evidence that something holy is taking shape within you. Obedience is rarely loud. It does not announce itself with applause or immediate reward. True obedience often feels costly, uncomfortable, and isolating. It demands surrender when the flesh craves control. It calls for restraint when desire wants expression. It asks for patience when urgency feels justified. In this way, obedience becomes a battlefield where the Spirit issues commands rooted in eternal truth, and the flesh rebels with arguments grounded in fear, habit, pleasure, and pride. Many believers misunderstand this struggle. They assume that once they commit their lives to God, resistance should vanish. They believe that spiritual maturity means the absence of temptation, doubt, or inner conflict. But Scripture and lived experience reveal the opposite. Growth in the Spirit often intensifies the war, not because God withdraws His grace, but because the flesh recognizes its influence is being threatened. The closer a person draws to spiritual alignment, the more fiercely the flesh fights to retain dominance. This war is quiet because it happens in decisions no one else sees. It happens when you choose restraint instead of indulgence, when you forgive instead of retaliate, when you remain faithful instead of convenient, when you obey a command that offers no immediate benefit and may even bring loss. The world rarely celebrates such moments, yet heaven records every one of them. This text explores the nature of this inner war, not as a theological abstraction, but as a lived reality. It examines why the flesh resists obedience, how the Spirit communicates, and what it truly means to submit when everything within you wants to resist. This is not about perfection, but about alignment. Not about self-denial for its own sake, but about surrender that leads to freedom. The quiet war of obedience is not meant to destroy you. It is meant to refine you. Why the flesh always resists spiritual authority? The flesh resists spiritual authority because obedience threatens its throne. The flesh is not merely the physical body, nor is it limited to sinful actions alone. In its deeper sense, the flesh represents the self-directed nature of humanity, the part of us that wants autonomy without accountability, desire without discipline, and control without submission. When the Spirit commands, it does not negotiate with this nature, it exposes it. And exposure is what the flesh fears most. From the moment the Spirit speaks, a tension arises. The Spirit communicates with clarity, but not always with comfort. Its commands often contradict instinct, emotion, and personal preference. The flesh, on the other hand, operates through immediacy. It wants relief now, satisfaction now, validation now. When obedience requires waiting, enduring, or trusting without visible outcomes, the flesh interprets this as a threat. This resistance is not always loud or obvious. Often the flesh disguises rebellion as logic. It argues that the timing is wrong, that the command is unreasonable, that the cost is too high. It reframes disobedience as self-care, wisdom, or practicality. In this way, the flesh does not openly deny God. It subtly reinterprets His voice to suit its own agenda. One of the most dangerous aspects of the flesh is its ability to spiritualize resistance. It can quote Scripture, recall past blessings, and even acknowledge God's power, all while refusing to obey His present command. This is why obedience is not primarily about knowledge. Many people know what God desires, yet remain stuck in resistance because knowing does not require surrender. Obedience does. The flesh also resists because spiritual authority dismantles identity structures built on control. The flesh defines itself by what it wants, what it feels, and what it can secure. The Spirit defines identity by who you are becoming in alignment with divine purpose. When the Spirit commands, it often asks you to release identities that once provided comfort, even if they no longer provide life. The flesh clings to these identities because they feel familiar, even when they are destructive. Fear plays a central role in this resistance. The flesh fears loss, exposure, rejection, and uncertainty. Obedience often leads into unknown territory, where outcomes are not guaranteed and comfort is not assured. The flesh prefers predictable misery over uncertain transformation. It would rather remain in a known prison than risk freedom it cannot yet understand. Another reason the flesh resists spiritual authority is because obedience interrupts cycles of gratification. Many habits, relationships, and patterns persist not because they are good, but because they are soothing. The Spirit's command often disrupts these cycles, calling for separation, discipline, or change. The flesh interprets this disruption as pain, even when it is healing. This is why obedience often feels like death. In a sense, it is. It is the death of self-rule, self-justification, and self-centered desire. The flesh does not surrender easily because surrender means relinquishing the illusion of control. Yet paradoxically, this death is what leads to life. What the flesh fears as loss is often the doorway to freedom. Understanding this resistance is crucial. Without this awareness, believers may misinterpret the struggle as a sign they are doing something wrong. In reality, resistance often confirms that obedience matters. The flesh rarely fights commands that pose no threat to its dominance. The intensity of the struggle often reflects the significance of the transformation taking place. The quiet war of obedience is therefore not about silencing the flesh through force, but about recognizing its voice without submitting to it. The Spirit does not overpower. It invites. It does not coerce. It calls. The flesh rebels because it senses that obedience will reorient authority within the soul, and that reorientation is the beginning of true spiritual maturity. If this struggle feels familiar, it is because you are not weak. You are awakening. The war itself is evidence that the Spirit is active, speaking and leading. The flesh resists because it is losing ground. If this teaching resonates with you and you want to continue learning how to walk in obedience and spiritual strength, subscribe to the channel now and stay connected for the next parts of this series. How the Spirit speaks quietly while the flesh demands noise. The Spirit rarely shouts. This is one of the most misunderstood realities of spiritual life. Many people expect divine guidance to arrive with overwhelming force, unmistakable signs, or dramatic emotional experiences. Yet the Spirit most often speaks in stillness, through subtle conviction, gentle redirection, and quiet clarity. The flesh, however, thrives on noise. It demands urgency, stimulation, emotional intensity, and constant reassurance. This contrast creates confusion for those who have not yet learned to discern the nature of spiritual communication. The Spirit speaks in alignment with truth, not with adrenaline. Its voice is steady, consistent, and often repetitive. Not because it lacks creativity, but because truth does not change to accommodate desire. The flesh finds this frustrating. It prefers novelty over faithfulness, excitement over consistency, and sensation over substance. When the Spirit calls for obedience, the command may feel almost too simple. Forgive, wait, stop, let go, remain faithful, trust. These instructions do not feed the ego, nor do they satisfy emotional cravings. As a result, the flesh dismisses them as insignificant or impractical. Noise is one of the flesh's greatest tools of resistance. Noise does not only mean sound, it includes distraction, overthinking, emotional turbulence, endless internal dialogue, and external validation seeking. When the spirit speaks quietly, the flesh responds by amplifying everything else. Doubts become louder, fears multiply, opinions of others gain weight, past failures resurface. Future anxieties dominate the mind. All of this noise serves one purpose: to drown out the gentle authority of the spirit. The spirit often speaks through discomfort rather than excitement. There is a specific kind of unease that arises when you are about to compromise truth. It is not fear, but misalignment. The flesh hates this feeling and rushes to silence it. It does so by rationalizing, distracting, or numbing. Over time, if this pattern continues, a person may become skilled at ignoring the spirit's voice altogether. Not because the spirit stops speaking, but because the flesh has trained the soul to prioritize noise over truth. Another reason the flesh resists the quiet voice of the spirit is because silence exposes intention. In silence, there is no performance. No one is watching. There is no applause or immediate feedback. Obedience in silence reveals whether faith is genuine or transactional. The flesh prefers visible reward. It wants recognition, affirmation, and proof. The spirit often withholds these not as punishment, but as protection. Obedience that depends on reward is fragile. Obedience that is rooted in trust is resilient. The spirit also speaks through timing rather than impulse. It invites patience when the flesh demands action. It asks for restraint when desire insists on expression. This creates internal tension because the flesh interprets delay as denial. Yet spiritual delay is often preparation. The spirit sees outcomes the flesh cannot perceive. What feels like inactivity may actually be alignment taking place beneath the surface. The flesh grows restless during this process and begins to manufacture urgency, mistaking movement for progress. Emotional intensity is another area where the flesh tries to dominate communication. The flesh equates strong emotion with truth. If something feels powerful, exciting, or overwhelming, it assumes it must be right. The spirit does not rely on emotional manipulation. It speaks with calm authority, often cutting through emotion rather than amplifying it. This is why moments of deep clarity often arrive after emotional storms, not during them. The flesh resists this because calm does not feed emotional addiction. The spirit's voice is also persistent but patient. It does not force compliance. It will return to the same instruction repeatedly, waiting for willingness. The flesh grows irritated by this repetition. It wants new answers rather than obedience to old ones. Many people seek fresh revelation when what they truly need is faithfulness to what has already been revealed. The flesh resists obedience by chasing complexity. The spirit calls for simplicity. One of the clearest indicators that the spirit is speaking is the alignment between conviction and peace. Even when the instruction is difficult, there is a deep, quiet sense of rightness. The flesh cannot tolerate this peace because peace removes its leverage. Fear loses power, control weakens, anxiety diminishes. The flesh thrives in chaos because chaos allows it to justify impulsive decisions. The spirit's peace exposes the unnecessary nature of much of the flesh's urgency. Learning to hear the spirit requires intentional stillness. Stillness is threatening to the flesh because it removes stimulation. It forces confrontation with truth. This is why many people avoid silence. They fill every moment with noise, content, conversation, and activity. In doing so, they unintentionally silence the spirit, not because God withdraws, but because the soul never becomes quiet enough to listen. The quiet voice of the spirit is not weak. It is authoritative precisely because it does not need volume. It does not argue. It does not compete. It simply speaks and waits. The flesh rebels against this because waiting feels like loss of control. Yet in learning to wait, the soul learns to trust, and trust is the foundation of obedience. As spiritual maturity grows, discernment sharpens. The believer begins to recognize the difference between urgency and conviction, between emotion and truth, between noise and guidance. The flesh does not disappear, but its influence weakens. The Spirit's quiet authority becomes more recognizable, more familiar, more trusted. Obedience becomes less about internal debate and more about alignment. If you find yourself overwhelmed by inner noise, constant mental conflict, or emotional urgency, it may not mean you are far from God. It may mean the Spirit is speaking, and the flesh is afraid of what obedience will require. Learning to quiet the noise is not about silencing thoughts, but about choosing which voice holds authority. The quiet war of obedience is often won in moments no one sees, when you choose stillness over impulse, trust over control, and truth over comfort. The Spirit will not compete with noise, but when you choose to listen, it will lead you with clarity that no amount of noise can replace. If this message is helping you understand the inner battle between spirit and flesh, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next part of this series and continue growing in spiritual discernment and obedience. Why obedience feels like loss before it becomes freedom. Obedience almost always feels like loss before it ever feels like freedom. This is one of the greatest paradoxes of the spiritual life, and also one of the primary reasons the flesh resists it so fiercely. From the perspective of the flesh, obedience looks like restriction, limitation, surrender, and denial. It feels like something is being taken away. Control, comfort, pleasure, certainty, timing, and even identity itself can seem threatened when the Spirit calls for obedience. The flesh interprets this as danger because it has learned to define safety through possession and control rather than trust. The Spirit does not begin by explaining what obedience will eventually produce. It begins by asking for surrender. This order is intentional. If the full outcome were revealed in advance, obedience would become a transaction rather than an act of faith. The flesh would comply for the reward, not because truth was recognized as worthy in itself. But true obedience must precede understanding. It must come before clarity. It must exist even when the benefits are invisible. This is why obedience feels costly at first. It strips the soul of its usual bargaining tools. Loss is terrifying to the flesh because the flesh measures life through accumulation. More pleasure, more recognition, more certainty, more control. Obedience often demands the opposite. It calls for subtraction. Let go. Walk away. Remain silent. Forgive without being validated. Wait without guarantees. Trust without proof. To the flesh, this feels like diminishing oneself. Yet in the economy of the Spirit, subtraction is often the pathway to multiplication. What is released externally is often restored internally with greater depth and permanence. One of the reasons obedience feels like loss is because it confronts attachment. The flesh does not simply desire things, it bonds with them. It attaches identity, security, and meaning to people, habits, outcomes, and roles. When the Spirit commands obedience, it often targets these attachments, not because they are always sinful, but because they have become substitutes for trust in God. The flesh panics when attachments are threatened because it equates attachment with survival. The Spirit, however, seeks freedom, not survival at the cost of truth. Obedience also feels like loss because it removes the illusion of self-authorship. The flesh wants to believe it is the primary architect of life. It wants credit for success and autonomy over direction. When obedience is required, the soul must acknowledge that it is not sovereign, that its life is guided, not self-generated. This can feel humiliating to the ego. The flesh resists because obedience exposes dependence, and dependence feels like weakness to a self-centered nature. In reality, dependence on God is not weakness. It is alignment with reality. Another layer of perceived loss comes from delayed gratification. Obedience rarely offers immediate emotional reward. In fact, it often brings discomfort, loneliness, misunderstanding, and internal struggle before peace ever arrives. The flesh is wired for immediacy. It wants relief now, resolution now, satisfaction now. When obedience asks the soul to endure tension without quick relief, the flesh interprets this as unnecessary suffering. Yet endurance is precisely what strengthens spiritual authority. A soul that can obey without immediate comfort becomes resilient, grounded, and unshakable. There is also the loss of familiarity. Even unhealthy patterns feel safe when they are known. The flesh prefers predictable pain over unfamiliar peace. Obedience often leads into unknown territory where old coping mechanisms no longer work. This creates vulnerability. The flesh fears vulnerability because it removes defenses. But vulnerability before God is not exposure for harm. It is openness for healing. The Spirit leads the soul through discomfort, not to punish it, but to rewire its understanding of safety. Many people abandon obedience prematurely because they interpret the initial discomfort as confirmation that something is wrong. They assume that God's will should feel affirming, energizing, and emotionally rewarding from the start. When obedience instead feels heavy, lonely, or painful, they conclude they have misunderstood the Spirit. In truth, this discomfort often confirms that obedience is genuine. The flesh does not resist what does not threaten it. The intensity of the resistance often corresponds to the depth of transformation taking place. Freedom does not arrive at the moment of surrender. It arrives through surrender. There is a process in which the soul gradually loosens its grip on what once defined it. As attachments weaken, new capacities emerge. Peace replaces anxiety. Clarity replaces confusion. Integrity replaces inner division. What once felt like loss begins to feel like lightness. The soul realizes it is no longer carrying what it was never meant to carry. One of the most misunderstood aspects of freedom is that it does not mean unlimited choice. True freedom is alignment with purpose. A train is most free when it remains on its tracks. Off the tracks, it does not gain freedom, it derails. Obedience provides structure, not restriction. It creates boundaries within which life can move with power and direction. The flesh mistakes boundaries for imprisonment because it does not understand purpose. The Spirit knows that without boundaries, strength becomes chaos. Obedience also feels like loss because it dismantles false versions of self. Many identities are built not on truth, but on survival strategies. The strong one, the independent one, the pleaser, the controller, the achiever. The Spirit may call for obedience that contradicts these identities. Rest instead of striving, trust instead of control, silence instead of explanation. The flesh experiences this as the loss of self, when in reality it is the shedding of masks that were never meant to be permanent. As obedience continues, something shifts. The soul begins to notice that what it feared losing no longer holds the same power. The desire weakens, the attachment loosens, the urgency fades. What once felt essential now feels optional. This is not suppression, it is transformation. The Spirit does not remove desire by force, but by reordering love. When love is redirected toward truth, lesser desires lose their grip naturally. Freedom eventually reveals itself not as excitement, but as stability, the absence of constant inner conflict, the quiet confidence of alignment, the ability to say no without guilt and yes without fear. The flesh promised freedom through indulgence and control, but delivered anxiety and restlessness. The Spirit promised nothing but truth, and delivered peace that does not depend on circumstances. The journey from loss to freedom is not linear. There are moments of doubt, regression, and fatigue, but each act of obedience strengthens the soul's capacity to trust. Over time, obedience becomes less about sacrifice and more about clarity. The soul begins to recognize that what once felt like loss was actually the removal of weight, that what it feared releasing was the very thing preventing it from walking freely. If obedience feels heavy right now, it does not mean you are failing. It may mean you are in the narrow passage between surrender and freedom. The flesh screams at this stage because it senses its influence is diminishing. Do not interpret the noise as truth. The Spirit's work is often quiet, gradual, and irreversible. Freedom is not found by protecting the self at all costs. It is found by entrusting the self to a higher authority. Obedience may cost you comfort, timing, and familiarity, but it will give you something the flesh never can: inner coherence, lasting peace, and a life that no longer feels divided against itself. If this message is speaking to your current struggle and helping you understand why obedience feels difficult before it feels liberating, subscribe to the channel now so you can continue this journey with the next part of this series and grow stronger in spiritual clarity and freedom. When delayed obedience becomes silent disobedience, one of the most subtle dangers in the quiet war between the spirit and the flesh is delayed obedience. Unlike open rebellion, delayed obedience does not feel sinful. It feels reasonable, cautious, even wise. It tells itself that the intention to obey is enough, that timing can be adjusted, that clarity must come before action. Yet in spiritual reality, delayed obedience often becomes silent disobedience, not because the command was rejected outright, but because it was postponed until it lost its power. The Spirit speaks in moments, not indefinitely. While God is patient, spiritual direction is often time-sensitive. There are windows in which obedience carries a specific weight, alignment, and consequence. When the flesh delays, it is not merely waiting, it is negotiating. It is seeking a version of obedience that costs less, feels safer, or preserves control. In doing so, it quietly replaces submission with preference. Delayed obedience is appealing because it avoids confrontation. Immediate obedience forces the soul to act before it feels ready. It requires trust without guarantees. Delay allows the flesh to remain comfortable while appearing cooperative. It says, "I will obey later," but later becomes a moving target. Over time, the urgency fades, conviction dulls, and what once felt clear becomes uncertain. The flesh thrives in this fog because confusion weakens resolve. One of the most deceptive aspects of delayed obedience is how it mimics discernment. The flesh frames delay as prudence, discernment, or patience. It insists on more confirmation, more signs, more reassurance. Yet the Spirit often gives clarity before comfort, direction before explanation. When clarity has already been given, seeking further confirmation is not discernment, it is avoidance. The flesh does not want more truth, it wants more time. Time is one of the flesh's favorite allies. With time, emotions settle, urgency fades, and conviction weakens. What once felt like a clear call becomes just another thought. The flesh understands this dynamic intuitively. It does not need to overpower the Spirit. It only needs to stall. Every delay gives it space to reassert influence, to reframe the narrative, to slowly pull the soul back toward familiarity. Delayed obedience also erodes spiritual sensitivity. Each time a clear instruction is postponed, the inner response becomes slower. The soul learns, unintentionally, that it can hear the Spirit without responding. Over time, this creates a dangerous pattern, hearing without obeying. The Spirit continues to speak, but the soul no longer feels the same weight of response. This is not because God withdraws his voice, but because the heart becomes less responsive to it. There is also a relational cost to delayed obedience. Obedience is not merely a rule-based action, it is a response within relationship. When a command is given and consistently delayed, trust weakens. Not God's trust in the person, but the person's awareness of God's closeness. Obedience strengthens intimacy because it aligns the will with divine direction. Delay creates distance, not through punishment, but through misalignment. The flesh often delays obedience by focusing on outcomes rather than instruction. It wants to know how things will turn out before committing. What will this cost me? How will others react? Will this be worth it? The Spirit rarely answers these questions in advance. Obedience is not a guarantee of ease. It is an act of alignment. When obedience is postponed until outcomes are visible, it ceases to be obedience and becomes calculation. Another reason delayed obedience becomes silent disobedience is that circumstances change, opportunities close, relationships shift, internal readiness fades. The instruction that once required courage now requires regret. The flesh then reframes the situation, saying the moment has passed or the instruction no longer applies. In reality, the cost of delay has already been paid, and the fruit that obedience would have produced is no longer accessible in the same way. Delayed obedience also fragments the inner life. The soul lives in a state of unresolved tension, knowing what it should do, but not doing it. This creates internal noise, anxiety, and spiritual fatigue. The flesh promises relief through delay, but delivers restlessness instead. The Spirit offers peace through alignment, but that peace remains inaccessible until obedience occurs. Many people confuse God's patience with permission to delay. God's patience exists to allow repentance and growth, not to endorse postponement. The Spirit does not pressure, but it does invite response. When that invitation is repeatedly deferred, the soul becomes spiritually stagnant, not because God has stopped working, but because movement requires cooperation. There is also the illusion that delayed obedience preserves freedom. The flesh fears that immediate obedience will lock the soul into a path it cannot escape. In reality, delayed obedience often narrows options rather than expanding them. Obedience opens paths, delay closes them. What the flesh calls freedom is often just indecision disguised as caution. Immediate obedience does not require full understanding. It requires trust. This is why it feels risky. But spiritual growth has always been built on steps taken without full visibility. The flesh wants certainty before movement. The Spirit asks for movement before certainty. This reversal is uncomfortable, but it is essential. Faith does not follow sight. Sight follows faith. Delayed obedience also weakens spiritual authority. Authority is strengthened through action, not intention. A soul that obeys quickly develops clarity, confidence, and discernment. A soul that delays remains unsure, internally divided, and reactive. Over time, the difference becomes visible not only internally, but externally in the fruit of one's life. The quiet tragedy of delayed obedience is that it often goes unnoticed. There is no dramatic fall, no obvious rebellion. Life continues. Responsibilities are met. Spiritual language is maintained. Yet something vital is missing. Momentum is lost. Sensitivity fades. Joy diminishes. The soul feels stuck without knowing why. Often the answer lies not in what was done wrong, but in what was never done at all. Immediate obedience does not mean reckless action. It means responding faithfully to what has already been made clear. It means acting before the flesh has time to negotiate away conviction. It means trusting that alignment matters more than comfort. The Spirit honors such obedience not always with ease, but with clarity and peace that cannot be manufactured. If you sense that you have been delaying something the Spirit has already made clear, this is not condemnation. It is invitation. Obedience can still restore alignment, but delay always carries cost. The quiet war of obedience is often won or lost in these moments, when the soul chooses whether to act now or negotiate later. If this message is revealing areas where delay has replaced obedience in your life, and you want to continue learning how to respond to the Spirit with clarity and courage, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next and final part of this series. Living under spiritual authority, without becoming a prisoner of the flesh. The ultimate goal of the quiet war of obedience is not the destruction of the flesh, but the restoration of proper authority within the soul. Many misunderstand spiritual authority and assume it means constant self-denial, emotional suppression, or living in a state of internal conflict forever. In truth, spiritual authority brings order, not torment. It does not erase desire, but reorients it. It does not silence the human experience, but aligns it with truth. Living under spiritual authority means the spirit leads, the flesh responds, and the soul finds peace in alignment rather than exhaustion in resistance. The flesh becomes a prison only when it is allowed to rule. When desire dictates direction, emotion determines truth, and comfort becomes the highest value, the soul slowly loses its freedom. What begins as self-expression often ends as self-enslavement. The flesh promises autonomy but delivers compulsion. It insists on freedom without boundaries. Yet boundaries are precisely what make freedom sustainable. The Spirit establishes authority not to restrict life, but to protect it from self-destruction. Spiritual authority begins internally. Before it ever manifests as discipline, behavior, or lifestyle, it is established in the will. The will decides which voice holds final authority. The flesh is persuasive, emotional, and persistent. The Spirit is calm, clear, and consistent. Living under spiritual authority means training the will to recognize truth even when desire disagrees. This training is gradual. It is built through repeated acts of obedience, especially when those acts feel small, unseen, or unrewarded. One of the greatest fears of the flesh is that submitting to spiritual authority will erase individuality. This fear is rooted in misunderstanding. The Spirit does not flatten personality or suppress uniqueness. It removes distortion. Many traits that feel essential to identity are actually coping mechanisms formed through fear, trauma, or insecurity. When the Spirit assumes authority, these distortions are gently dismantled. What remains is not loss of self, but clarity of self. The soul becomes more itself, not less. Living under spiritual authority also requires redefining strength. The flesh defines strength as dominance, control, and self-sufficiency. The Spirit defines strength as faithfulness, humility, and endurance. Under spiritual authority, strength is not proven by overpowering others or circumstances, but by remaining aligned when it would be easier to compromise. This kind of strength is quiet, but it is unbreakable. It does not depend on mood, affirmation, or success. It is rooted in conviction. One of the most liberating aspects of spiritual authority is the end of constant inner negotiation. When the Spirit leads and the flesh is no longer allowed to argue endlessly, mental exhaustion decreases. Decisions become clearer, boundaries become firmer, guilt diminishes. Not because mistakes never happen, but because direction is no longer constantly questioned. The soul learns to move forward without second-guessing every step. This clarity is one of the clearest signs that authority has been properly established. Living under spiritual authority does not mean the flesh disappears. Temptation does not vanish. Desire still arises. Emotion still fluctuates. What changes is response. The flesh loses its power to dictate action. Its voice becomes information rather than command. Desire can be acknowledged without being obeyed. Emotion can be felt without being followed blindly. This distinction is crucial. Suppression creates tension, discernment creates freedom. Spiritual authority also transforms discipline. Discipline under the flesh is punishment-driven. It is fueled by fear, shame, or control. Discipline under the Spirit is purpose-driven. It is fueled by alignment and love. What once felt forced begins to feel natural, not because effort disappears, but because effort now serves a clear direction. Discipline becomes an expression of devotion rather than self-coercion. Another mark of living under spiritual authority is peace during uncertainty. The flesh panics when outcomes are unclear. It demands reassurance, timelines, and guarantees. The Spirit offers trust instead. A soul under spiritual authority can move forward without needing to know everything. It rests in obedience rather than certainty. This does not eliminate responsibility or wisdom, but it removes anxiety as a decision-maker. Spiritual authority also reorders relationships. When the flesh leads, relationships are often transactional, dependent on validation, control, or fear of loss. When the Spirit leads, relationships become places of truth rather than identity. Approval is no longer necessary for obedience. Rejection no longer derails purpose. This creates emotional independence that is not cold or detached, but grounded and stable. One of the deepest freedoms of spiritual authority is release from self-justification. The flesh constantly seeks to explain, defend, and prove itself. Under spiritual authority, the need to be understood by everyone diminishes. Obedience becomes more important than reputation. Truth becomes more valuable than being right. This quiet confidence frees the soul from exhausting cycles of comparison and validation. Living under spiritual authority also reshapes suffering. The flesh interprets suffering as failure or punishment. The Spirit uses suffering as refinement. Not all pain is redemptive, but when aligned with obedience, even pain can produce clarity, depth, and strength. The soul learns that obedience does not prevent difficulty, but it prevents meaninglessness. Suffering without alignment is chaos. Suffering with obedience becomes formation. Another essential aspect of spiritual authority is consistency. The flesh is reactive. It responds based on mood, circumstance, and impulse. The Spirit is steady. Living under spiritual authority means learning to act consistently even when feelings fluctuate. This consistency builds integrity. Integrity is not perfection, it is alignment between belief and action. Over time, integrity becomes a source of inner peace because the soul is no longer divided against itself. The flesh often accuses spiritual authority of being restrictive. In reality, restriction is already present under flesh rule, but it is hidden. Compulsion restricts, addiction restricts, fear restricts. The Spirit replaces these hidden restrictions with visible, purposeful boundaries. These boundaries do not suffocate, they protect. They create space for growth rather than chaos. Spiritual authority also teaches patience with process. Transformation is not instant. The flesh demands immediate change or immediate relief. The Spirit works through progression. Setbacks do not negate authority. Struggle does not invalidate alignment. What matters is direction. A soul under spiritual authority continues to return to truth even after failure. It does not abandon obedience because of imperfection. As the Spirit's authority becomes established, obedience becomes less dramatic and more integrated. It is no longer a constant battle, but a posture. Decisions are filtered through alignment rather than impulse. The soul becomes responsive rather than reactive. Life does not become easier, but it becomes clearer, and clarity reduces unnecessary suffering. The quiet war of obedience does not end with victory over the flesh. It ends with proper order. The Spirit leads, the soul listens, the flesh follows. This order creates harmony rather than tension, not because conflict never arises, but because authority is no longer in question. Living under spiritual authority is not about becoming less human. It is about becoming whole. It is the restoration of unity within the self, the end of fragmentation, the end of inner civil war. What the flesh feared as loss becomes the foundation of peace. What obedience demanded becomes the source of freedom. If this final message has helped you understand how to live under spiritual authority without becoming trapped by the flesh, and if this series has brought clarity to your inner struggle, subscribe to the channel now so you can continue growing in truth, obedience, and spiritual strength.